Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SETA Foundation one more time. We had an important panel today. This week on Monday, there was a referendum in northern Iraq, and KRG held the referendum and declared the results as of yesterday. It created a lot of controversy. It was a controversial referendum, and all the instability in Middle East, it added another layer of dispute and tension in the region among different regions, and it created different alignments and partnerships, and we will see the implications of this. Today we have four important panelists, and we will discuss the possible implications of this referendum to Turkish, Iraqi and Turkish KRG relations, as well as the overall effects of the referendum to the region. And the speakers are Daniel Server, the Academic Director of Conflict Management Center in Johns Hopkins University; Dennis Natali, Director of Center for Strategic Research, National Defense University; Kadir Üstün, Executive Director of SETA Foundation; and Leslie Dudden, our research assistant. They just wrote a report actually about the region and the cooperation between Turkey and KRG in the region. So they will go over that report as well in their presentations. We will start with Kadir Üstün, and if Kadir, you can provide us a general framework of Turkey-KRG relations, how the relations are evolved, and how we got here, and what can be the possible future trajectories for the Turkish KRG and Turkish Iraqi relation following the referendum.
Thank you, Kılıç. It's been several months. We started this project on the Turkey-KRG relationship with Leslie. It was in many ways her initiative, so we started doing research and trying to find out what this relationship was all about. Obviously, it seems obvious right now that energy and economic relationship would be the centerpiece of that, and Leslie will talk about that relationship and how deep it goes, and of course there's the political aspects of it. I just want to provide a broad overview, and then Leslie can talk about those particulars as well that we talk about in the report. Going back to 2003, Turkey denied access to U.S. forces for the invasion of Iraq. Turkey, for a while, tried to figure out, as you know, AK party had just come to power. It was a difficult time, difficult decision. There was a lot of back and forth between Turkey and the U.S. about the negotiations for the U.S. troops being able to use Turkish territory. But during that time and up until about 2007, you have sort of Turkey. You don't really have a relationship between Turkey and Kurdistan Regional Government. Only after 2007, you start seeing a lot of economic activity emerging. There's a lot of Turkish businesses in northern Iraq, in the Kurdistan region, Iraqi Kurdistan region. That relationship, after several years afterwards, what we call the resolution process in the inside Turkey between the Turkish government and the PKK and the Öcalan. When that project started, that piece of the relationship between KRG and Turkey became even more important politically. It proved that basically Turkey's Kurdish questions, quote unquote, at home had regional implications, and the relationship with KRG could contribute to it, to the resolution of that process. With that perspective, as you know, Barzani himself visited Turkey, gave speeches about the peace process. This lasted a couple of years. But the Kobani crisis was the breakdown of that process. And we saw in the Kobani crisis another important aspect about the relationship in terms of intra-Kurdish struggle, power struggle. As you know, the PYD at the time did not want Barzani forces in Kobani. They wanted that kind of military victory for themselves. And Turkey facilitated, at the end, KRG forces coming in through Turkish territory. That was a first for Turkey as well, to go to Kobani and help defeat ISIS in Kobani. So, but at that time, the US started supporting PYD under Obama administration, and that created a divergence between US and Turkey in terms of their Syria policies, but also coordination and synchronization between the US and Turkey vis-a-vis the Kurdish, so the PKK, became more and more difficult over time. And we are still kind of, the relationship is still suffering from that. But the important point for today's subject is that the relationship with KRG, with Barzani, KDP, to sort of, and almost creating a front, perhaps almost is too much, but creating a front against PKK forces and what they want to do inside Turkey. Fast forward to today, why Turkey is so against the referendum, and why it's still mulling sort of sanctions against the Kurdistan Regional Government. There has been some talk, some research. Some people said Turkey would welcome it and potentially even embrace this referendum, but it didn't turn out to be that way. Turkey is adamantly opposed to it. Of course, several factors are involved there. One conclusion I draw is, yes, we have a strong relationship, economic partnership, security work, and energy. There's many aspects to regional also, in terms of regional dynamics, PYD, Iran, others, etc. But we won't go as far as enabling an Iraqi independent Kurdistan. So that's kind of where Turkey's patience runs out, so to speak. Which is why Turkey opposed this. And the other thing is, obviously, for a state like Turkey, territorial integrity is central. So Iraq's breakup, you see Turkey adjusting to a reality on the ground where Kurdistan regional government is semi-autonomous. It's under a federal structure. It's doing a lot of things on its own. You could argue that it's almost independent, but that's where Turkey kind of stops short of supporting KRG politically, and the fact that the Barzani or KDP or KRG, let's say, has not negotiated this with any outside power, including Turkey. Turkey is one of the main patrons of that region. This was not this is premature, putting the horse before the cart in many ways. If there was a broad international endorsement, which is very, very difficult to achieve with or without this referendum, it could be an international issue, it could be discussed separately, but you find Turkey obviously not wanting to midwife an Iraqi Kurdistan just because it has strong relationship with the region. And also, this being Barzani's political power play in many ways to strengthen his hand against other Kurdish groups. As you know, they've been calling for presidential elections, and those elections have been postponed because of ISIS activities in the region. They see this, Turks are seeing this only as a power play rather than a realistic sort of future-looking move that would actually stabilize the region and help contribute to stabilization of the region. As you know, Turkey also worked on Iraq's unity by trying to involve Sunnis in the process. It was involved in the constitution writing process. It supported any effort to keep Iraq together, but Maliki policies, as you know, were very sectarian and divided up the country in sort of irreparable ways. And then the other thing is, of course, Turkey worries about what happens in Kirkuk. There's a real potential for ethnic conflict there. Turkmens are close to Turkey. Turkey worries about their security as well. And PKK's ambitions in Syria, in northern Syria, is also a major factor in how Turkey looks at this. When you go back 10, 15 years, you have more or less, stable countries with territorial integrity not being questioned, but within about a decade, we came to a situation both in Iraq and Syria. You have a highly fractured sort of states, or some would call them failed states by now, or semi-failed states. Out of this, declaration of independence really threatens the regional sort of stability even further. I think the main rationale for Turkey to oppose this is the territorial integrity, but of course many things underneath that in terms of Turkey's worries about PKK's activities in northern Iraq, the international legitimacy that those activities have drawn, among others. So I'll just leave it there, and then we'll discuss more later, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadir. And Leslie, if you can go a little bit more detailed about the report that you wrote, especially the security, partnership, and economic cooperation, current state of those, and what can be the possible implications of this referendum for both energy cooperation and also the security partnership among these countries.
Great, yeah, and I want to start by thanking Kadir and Kılıç for including me on this panel today. I feel quite honored to be up here with this very distinguished group. He said we sort of started looking at the issue of Turkey's relationship with northern Iraq in about January or February. And it really is this very fascinating story of Turkey reconciling sort of its own domestic security concerns with the possibilities that it started to see coming out of, a growing autonomous region in northern Iraq. So we wanted to sort of determine what the main drivers were behind Turkey's move to sort of partner with the KRG. And we came up with the main two things, which are fairly obvious, being energy and the energy opportunities that were coming out of the region, and also security, which Kadir just touched on. In terms of economic relations between Turkey and the KRG, as well as just Turkey and Iraq as a whole, have really exploded since 2007. As of today, about 80% of all goods that are sold in Iraqi Kurdistan come in from Turkey. And as of 2015, trade between Turkey and Iraq was $8.5 billion a year, which made it Turkey's third largest partner. While this isn't indicative of, it's harder to find breakdowns on just KRG-specific numbers, it shows that, Iraq has really become an important part of sort of Turkey's regional projection and its economic relations. In the KRG today, there are over 1,000 Turkish firms operating. About 40% of all foreign firms operating in the region are Turkish. A lot of this is involved in, of course, energy and also construction. Turkish firms have played large roles in the construction of the Dohuk and Erbil airports. So this is sort of, when you go around Iraqi Kurdistan, I think it's hard not to see places where Turkish sort of economic inputs, they've really helped the country and really play a large role in sort of the development of that region. Energy cooperation between Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan has also been a source of tension between Turkey and Baghdad. Sort of Turkey's decision to allow the KRG to export autonomously from Baghdad and sort of the budgetary issues that have gone on in the last decade or so regarding the KRG's decisions have not always made for easy relations between Ankara and Baghdad. But one of the main drivers for Turkey's decision to do this is its own energy dependence. Turkey relies on external sources for 99% of its natural gas, the majority of which comes from Iran and Russia, which while it's hard to see sort of the KRG natural gas exports to Turkey catching up to that anytime soon, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of infrastructure. Iran and Russia are such a dominant part of Turkey's energy imports that it really needs to look for ways to diversify away from that. In terms of oil, Turkey imports 89% of its oil, the majority of which, 45%, comes through the Kirkuk-Yamurluk pipeline, which has been operating since the 1970s in Iraq into Turkey. And so in sort of when Turkey has undertaken several pipeline projects with the KRG, which we sort of detail in the report, which have allowed the region to sort of increase its exports into Turkey. And while Turkey itself only purchases Kurdish oil as sort of a supplement that has played a larger role for other countries. There's some sources that say that Israel imports as much as 75% of its oil from Iraqi Kurdistan. Sort of the other main driver of Turkey's relationship with the KRG are security issues. Building off a little bit of security, one of these is pipeline security. We calculated that between June 2010 and February 2017, there were approximately 25 attacks on pipeline infrastructure in the Kurdistan region, the majority of which came from PKK and PKK-affiliated groups. And then in 2014, you start seeing ISIS attacks on the pipelines as well. And this is obviously important for Turkey, who is a very storied, relationship with the PKK and sort of its domestic terrorism campaign in Turkey. But also, these pipeline attacks really harm the KRG, especially as it has come under budgetary constraints since ISIS came across the region. There was an August 2015 attack that cost the region $250 million in oil revenue, and another one in 2016 that cost about $200 million. So clearly these attacks, really have an impact on the Kurdistan region and Turkey financially. Another important area in terms, as Kadir talked about more, was the PKK and sort of PKK positions operating out of northern Iraq. Right now, Turkey is most, I think, concerned about PKK positions in Sinjar, which it sort of was able to move into in 2014 as coalition airstrikes were sort of pushing ISIS out of that region. Turkey has made it known that it will not allow Sinjar to become another Kandil, which refers to the PKK's main operational base in the north, or main operational base. Another issue has been Kirkuk, and Kadir talked about this a little bit too, the issue of the ethnic Turkmen and security around Kirkuk. Turkey would prefer not to see the city and the region remain under Kurdish control as it sort of has after the Peshmerga forces were sort of effective in pushing ISIS out of that region. In terms of what the referendum could mean, Turkey has been pretty adamant that it is willing to sanction the region and to stop the pipeline flows, which would obviously be devastating for any sort of independence project that the region might want to undertake. It is absolutely dependent on its oil exports in order to pay salaries and sort of be economically viable. And therefore, Turkey really has sort of control or a huge deal of influence in whether or not any future independence project is economically viable. So I think that, when you look at this, really makes how Turkey handles the referendum moving forward and sort of the next moves that the Kurdistan government makes important for the future of the relationship. So,
Thank you. Thank you. And our third panelist, Deniz Natali. Deniz, can you talk about, you were in the region, and you just arrived actually last week from, and you have been doing research, I think both the Iraq and Syria part of it. And can you give us your perspective and probably a little bit about U.S. position about this referendum?
Certainly. First, am I hearing? Thank you to the SETA Foundation, and again, my disclaimer that these are my views and not those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or National Defense University. Yes, as I just came back again from Iraq, in the north, in the Kurdish region, as well as several days in Baghdad. So I won't get into the specific discussions with specific individuals, but what I would like to discuss today is how I see the referendum having played out. What is the political fallout, not only for the Kurdish region, but also its relations with the Iraqi government and external partners. What did the referendum succeed in doing? So many of us would have said, like myself included, this was not going to lead to independence, but one of the objectives was to enable the Kurdistan Regional Government to have greater leverage in negotiating with Baghdad in the future, whether that be territories or whatnot. And the other one was the result itself of what this showed. And so let me start with what did happen successfully. This was a successful indication, whether we agree that it was really 72% or not. It was a massive political rally for the Kurds, for particularly the president of the region, Masoud Barzani, to show the depth and the strength and the saliency of Kurdish nationalism. And that was a media event, whatever you may call it, but it did have a profound impact on local populations. And it was a way of unifying these groups. I was there even a couple of days before the referendum occurred, and there was a lot of fragmentation. The parliament wasn't even convened. And within a couple of days, you had a parliament convened that hasn't been convened in 2 years. You had political groups that were opposed that came together. And you had a massive, again, political rally in behalf of Kurdish nationalism. So that was a strong symbol, okay, that brought these groups together. It also showed, in my view, how strong the Kurdistan Democratic Party and Masoud Barzani's group is and how weak and fractured the other groups were. Whether that is permanent, I'm not sure, but at least at this point, all of the other groups, the No to referendum and all of these other groups, still were not able to challenge the KDP or to even project against the idea that, no, we don't want independence, because that's a red line as well. So these were some of the things domestically that were able to occur within a very short period of time that 2 days before weren't there. So now, still though, the balance sheet, in my view, shows significant political consequences and fallout that did not enhance the overall goal of moving toward independence, or in my view, actually undermining the autonomy that the Kurdistan region has. I don't see, in my view, right now, there's short term and there's medium term. And right now the emotions are running high on many ends. So I don't see this right now as enhancing the Kurdistan regional government's leverage with the Iraqis, the Iraqi government. Actually, there's a lot of ill will. I think that this referendum and the manner that it was done squandered a lot of the goodwill, not only among important partners inside Iraq, Arab Iraqi communities, but also regional actors, as my colleagues just indicated, and then I'll get to the international community as well, the United States and other groups. So what has happened, even before the referendum results occurred, you started to hear certain groups inside Iraq, and I don't like to make these Sunni, Shia, Kurd differentiations, but some of the sectarian divisions actually have been brought together. So what this referendum did was bring Sunni and Shia groups together, and that momentum was occurring anyway. You're starting to see a movement toward demands for a civil state in Iraq, anti-sectarianism, enhanced Iraqi nationalism. So just as the Iraqi Kurdish groups have reacted to the negativity to the referendum, so too have other Iraqi groups south of the Kurdistan region reacted to this in a very adamant way. Okay, so this is bringing together those Iraqi nationalist elements, but also would be more disconcerting for me if I was a Kurdish leader, those very important Sunni Arab communities in the disputed territories that are essential, not only largely populate the territories, but are essential for the stability of the Kurdistan region in the future. They also didn't support this referendum. There were a few. There were obviously Sunni Arab tribal groups that did support, but many of those joined the parliament in opposing the referendum. So I think that that was not a good sign for the Kurdistan region, who needs these other groups. And the fact that there are about 1 million Arabs living inside the Kurdistan region poses some problems. I'll give you an example. I had various conversations with different tribal groups and leaders across Iraq. And those working with the KRG said, what are we supposed to do now? If you want to have a Kurdish state, should we have an Arab state? This idea of an ethnic state pushed back a lot of the goodwill. How do we get represented in the Kurdish parliament and things like that. So there's that concern that has pushed away important partners. And some of the backlash right now that's happening. Airports will be closed. We'll see how long that goes, and a lot of these economic measures. But I don't want to get into what ifs. I'll get into what has also occurred. We talked about the regional responses, not only from Turkey, but from Iran. Weeks before, days before, there was a lot of pleading or a lot of attempted negotiations inside the region between different political parties. Don't do this. As public statements by Iranian officials said, we can't guarantee what some of these militia groups will do. Because up until this point, in some of these disputed areas, Iran has actually played a role in mediating between, let's say, PUK, Peshmerga, and some Hashd-e-Shab. That can no longer be counted on. Okay, so it's not a concern. I don't necessarily think there's going to be military forces of Turkish government or Iraqi government, but these undisciplined militia groups, and by that I don't just mean Shia groups, I don't like to make those comments, but any group that is annoyed enough about how this is playing out. It only takes one little spark that some of these undisciplined groups can misbehave, let's put it that way. So you've got that added worry. But most importantly, and again, all of these Iraqi Arab groups, Sunni, Shia, I don't care, they're committed to Iraqi nationalism and the territorial integrity of Iraq, just as Turkey is. So I think that there was an underestimation of how strong this is. But more importantly now is I think that this referendum, in the manner that it was conducted, squandered for the Kurdistan region, at least now, important international goodwill. That even though, in my understanding of what's happening in Washington, aside from individual members of Congress or retired so-and-so officials or lobbyists, and those voices were very strong narratives in the press. But I think that that should not have been the barometer of what official policy was. And so there should have been absolutely no surprise. And I was actually surprised that people were surprised inside the region. Here you go. So many students and people said, well, how come you responded this way? And I thought, but there was no indication at any point in time that there would be any official backing for this. But who can play a name game, whether it was the West's fault, whether it was the media inside the Kurdistan region's fault, I don't know. But there was a big gap between what some Kurdish folks thought was going to happen and what was clearly on the U.S. side and Western government's opinion of this, which it just was not going to be supported, while the anti-Daesh campaign was going on. So this was not helpful, as many have said, but it also comes at a time where many think that they actually gave a significant amount of support to the Kurds and the Kurdish Peshmerga, and this is how it was returned, how the favor was returned. And again, I am sure that there's a different interpretation from the Kurdish side, but this squandered very important political capital, and there's a lot of negative ill will from certain segments, and I wouldn't take that lightly. So there's some questions. Yes, the Kurdistan region is a partner, and just some comments. I was surprised too this last visit, and I spoke to many people and students and everybody, and they said, well, you're just bound to protect us anyway. It's your moral obligation. So I was worried. I said, well, aren't you worried? I'm worried that there will be all of this backlash locally. And many of the responses was, one, well, at least we've got your attention. I mean, this is an attention grabber. And second was, you're bound to protect us because you need us too much and because you wouldn't let that happen. And that's a frightening supposition to make, because if you're banking it on how bad has the region have to go under before we'll get your attention, that's almost brinkmanship to the point where you're undermining the stability of the region. But that's, again, different perceptions of what I picked up and where that's not the case. Well, I don't perceive that the case on the U.S. end. And finally, I want to make a final point about when I said I see this as been a temporary or a coup or a success in the sense that it enhanced the unity of the Kurdish parties at a time where they were very disunified. That is the case, but you can't forget the fact that just as if when Daesh came, there was a lot of problems that were put aside. This referendum has put aside temporarily a lot of problems that were not resolved. So the fact that the parliament was put together very quickly is good that it finally got started, but I think there were only like 65 or 67 people that went out of 111 seats. And some people walked out on it. So it's not that these fractious issues or issues of parliamentary democracy and institution building have been resolved. That I don't know how long the unity within the region remains. I think that the KRG can bank on, as long as there's opposition to this referendum, this can be, the Kurds can bank on this as victims, as bringing them together, and that will last for some time. But look what everybody else is doing to us, even though we all voted for it. So there's some time to bank on that. But nonetheless, in addition to what the regional states can do, how this will affect the Kurdistan region, one of my questions would be, to what extent could the Kurdistan regional government now provide the services and the salaries and the stability to all of these entities that it's claiming it wants to be part of the Kurdistan region, a so-called independent state or not? So it's not only what regional actors or internal actors will do to the Kurds, but what can they do to assure people that they're going to have a better off situation inside their region and not Baghdad? So minorities inside the disputed territories, as many of you know, were fragmented. I can't look at 72% and say, what does that mean? Those results were not broken down by localities. We don't have any real indicator of what the disputed territories really voted, because most Arabs and Turkmen didn't vote, and many of the minorities didn't either. So again, these are not clear. I'll just sum up with some final points. Given all of this, there's a lot going on. Again, short term, how long can both sides live out all of these economic repercussions and reactions? But I've heard often, this is not a matter of if, but when there will be a Kurdish state. I don't believe that for a minute, not even just with the Kurds, with anything, not just the Middle East. There's nothing inevitable about any of these processes. Given all of the reactions right now, there's as much a chance for instability or divisions within groups as there is a forward-moving process. I don't see anything forward-moving about a process that doesn't have the support of regional actors. There's highly complicated dynamics, is what I'm saying. And secondly, the Kurdish political agenda is superimposed over this. So how to move forward, I think a lot's going to depend on how the Kurdistan regional authorities manage this, how Baghdad manages this. One of the concerns, I would say, from U.S. officials and others is how this will impact the 2018 elections and how this will undermine an important ally and partner, which is the Iraqi government under Prime Minister Abadi. So this is a concern. Where the Kurds can leverage this or how the Iraqi government can leverage this, I'm not sure, but it certainly has enhanced this very, let's say, hardliner group inside the parliament that's going to force or pressure Prime Minister Abadi to react in a harsher way if he wants to keep this. And so that's a concern. It's the greater concern is what happens in Baghdad, not if the Kurds are going to have a state or not. And again, I just don't see, finally, there was always an issue saying, oh, it's a matter of timing. Or the Kurds don't have democratic institutions. That was never an issue in my analysis. Whether the Kurds have democratic institutions or not will affect what type of state it would be. Would it be, a kleptocracy? Will it be a poor, unstable state? But without support of regional actors. And there was a very important piece in the Wall Street Journal today looking at all of those other states that tried to break away. East Timor, South Sudan, Kosovo. There were failures on all ends. But even the South Sudanese, they negotiated with the parent government. So I don't see how any of this could ever occur because politics trumps all of this without the support of Turkey, without at least one regional actor. This is just a pipe dream. And I'm not trying to say Kurds don't have the right to do this, but it's how is all of this now going to backlash and actually undermine and limit the autonomy of the Kurdistan region, because I see the KRG in a worse situation now than it was even a week ago. And nobody really wants that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. And our final panelist, Daniel, if you can tell us a little more about possible future trajectory, whether would there be any kind of international recognition if there is a declaration of independence by the region?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to be talking about the longer term, very difficult uphill battle that the Iraqi Kurds have to be a recognized sovereign state. So I want to start by saying, look, the Iraqi Kurds have very good reasons for wanting independence. There is no doubt about that. I'll add that I don't think Turkey has improved its role in this situation with the crackdown on the Kurds inside Turkey, because that says to people inside Iraqi Kurdistan, what can I expect? Even the Turks, who are part of NATO, don't treat Kurds with the respect we think we deserve. So I think we have to start by acknowledging the very real reasons that Kurds would want independence. That said, you don't get independence by declaring it. Anybody can declare independence, and a lot of people do. And almost all those declarations of independence fail. A few of them lead to war. And a minute number in recent years, I can only think of two, have led to a velvet divorce. That's Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Serbia and Montenegro. Both highly negotiated in advance. So my advice to the Iraqi Kurds before this was negotiate it with Baghdad, because it's only that will get you a peaceful velvet divorce. Instead, they've gone ahead with this referendum for the many reasons that Denise and others have cited. I can't reverse that. I have to look ahead and say, okay, you've had a referendum, the will of the people, which was already well known, has now been formalized. What do you need to do to gain international recognition as a sovereign state? The first thing Erbil has to do is to negotiate proper borders with Baghdad. there isn't any substitute for this, because unless you have proper borders, recognition means nothing. Now, some people tell me, some people I'm more sympathetic with the Iraqi Kurds than maybe I am, tell me this can be done. This can be done. Even Kirkuk can be done. Basically, it's land for peace, which is a formula that hasn't worked elsewhere in the Middle East, but which is a perfectly decent proposition for establishing borders. In addition to agreeing on borders, though, Baghdad and Erbil will have to agree on state property, let's call it by that generic term. State property including international reserves, that is monetary reserves, oil stocks, embassies abroad have to be divided. There's a lot to bargain over. This can be done. It's been done in other instances. But it's a complicated and difficult negotiation. It's also the question of currency. Most sovereign states want to have their own currency. Now, there are quite a few states that have adopted the dollar and the euro in recent years. But I don't anticipate that Iraqi Kurdistan is going to be one of those. I think they'll want their own currency. They won't want Baghdad's currency. That's a tough issue. How do you divide the reserves in a way that ensures that you have a value of your currency that is viable, makes you viable on international markets? Sovereign debts will have to be divided up too. I don't know the situation in Iraq, which projects were built in Kurdistan or in southern Iraq, and how much money was borrowed from the World Bank or from other sovereigns, but all of that has to be fixed. Usually fixed in advance, because in order to enter the World Bank, somebody has to pay your arrears. And in order to pay your arrears, somebody has to know how much money you owe. It's already been mentioned, there are millions of Arabs, a million Arabs, let us say, who are living in Iraqi Kurdistan. I think there are a lot more than a million Kurds who are living not in Iraqi Kurdistan, but in the rest of Iraq. So there's a big question here about their citizenship. Do they get to choose citizenship? Are they forced to accept one citizenship or the other? What happens with their property? Is their property respected or not? Iraqi Kurdistan is going to be a landlocked country if it's ever independent. It's going to have to move vast quantities of oil and gas safely and economically, probably to markets mainly in Europe, Turkey and in Europe. It doesn't have the arrangements in place at this point. There are a couple of pipelines, but gas still can't be exported in serious quantity. And, frankly, it might hope to export much more oil as well. And all of that has to be arranged with the neighbors. The neighbors are not agreeable. Turkey is opposed. Iran is even more opposed, in my view. And Iran is more opposed mainly because of Eastern Kurdistan and their fear that an independent Iraqi Kurdistan will lead to rebellion, more rebellion than they already have in Eastern Kurdistan. Syria is still a mess, but someday Syria might be a very nice place to put a pipeline across. All of that's going to require arrangements in advance of recognition. Europe and the Gulf Cooperation Council are going to play important roles in all of this. They're a little bit removed from the immediate neighborhood. But look, Europe isn't friendly to secessions these days. They don't want a secession in Spain, Catalonia's secession, and they don't want one in Britain, even though they care less now that Brexit has happened. But there's no really good history, recent history, of secession in Europe. Gulf Cooperation Council is a potential source of a lot of investment in Iraqi Kurdistan. But who could be more concerned about secession than some of the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council? They're going to be afraid that Iraqi Kurdistan is an independent state will inspire rebellions inside their borders as well. To enter the UN, Iraqi Kurdistan, and by the way, bilateral recognitions count in the initial stages after you declare independence. Very important that your neighbors recognize you right away, and then that lines up a lot of other things. But the bilateral recognitions end, for a successful state, very quickly. Because once you're admitted to the UN General Assembly, you no longer require bilateral recognitions. There are many members of the UN General Assembly that have fewer bilateral recognitions than Kosovo, which has 110 or so, maybe 112, but hasn't been admitted into the UN and has remained in a kind of limbo as a result. It's not a terrible limbo for Kosovo. It could be a much worse limbo for Iraqi Kurdistan. In the Security Council has to recommend a member to the General Assembly. Inside the Security Council, I don't know what Russia will do. They've made a statement against the independence referendum. They have several $1 billion of recent investment by a sanctioned company in Iraqi Kurdistan. My guess is that in the end, they will come to terms with this because it will enhance their claims that the secessions that they engineered in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are valid. But China will be dead set against, for obvious reasons. It has secessionist provinces. It doesn't want to hear about more secessions. So Europe against, Americans probably against would be my guess, though the Americans have emphasized that it's the timing they objected to, not the principle that they objected to. The question is, could the timing ever be right for the Americans? I think it's difficult, to tell you the truth, because I think American relations with Turkey, once this war in Syria somehow comes to an end, the Americans will want to repair its relations with Turkey, and this question of Iraqi Kurdistan will be high on the Turkish agenda for repairing relations. It's only successful negotiations that will ensure Iraqi Kurdistan of recognition and independence as a sovereign state. Those negotiations are going to be extraordinarily difficult. They have absolutely nothing to do with the reasons why the Iraqi Kurds want and maybe even deserve independence in a certain sense. They are geopolitical considerations. They are not considerations of the rights of the Iraqi Kurds. But they are the considerations that will determine whether other countries recognize.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Before opening the floor for questions from the audience, let me ask a few questions to the guests. And let's start with you, Daniel. And you mentioned how difficult would be negotiations and what are the steps. So what is your expectation? What will KRG will do this referendum result?
Well, what I expect is that that Abadi will refuse to acknowledge the referendum result. He's called on the KRG to annul it, basically. I don't think the KRG will do that. He'll probably refuse to go to negotiations for a while. He'll certainly say he's not going to go to negotiations on independence. But at some point, the Americans, maybe others joining with them, will twist enough arms to get Erbil and Baghdad to a table someplace where they will discuss all the issues that I mentioned. First and foremost, borders. I think until borders are settled, and we know how difficult that is from how difficult it's been since the Constitution passed. But basically, the solution in the Constitution, which is to have the people of various districts decide, I think is fundamentally the right solution, whether Iraqi Kurdistan stays in Iraq or becomes independent. So I don't see any new solution to that problem. The question is, what would convince Baghdad and Erbil to actually implement Article 140?
Thank you. Then it's the same question, but in addition to that, you mentioned all of these different groups within the region actually rally around the referendum in the last couple of days of the referendum. So we know that this rally around the flag effects are usually temporary, and usually it ends up in a messy process. So what would be your expectation, in addition to my first question, what would be your expectation for the intergroup competition or rivalry in the region? And you can add some other Kurdish groups as well from other countries.
So in terms of the Baghdad-Erbil negotiations, I agree with them that any of this, at some point, I would see, and not immediately, there will be efforts to bring negotiating groups between Baghdad and Erbil together, because it's in nobody's interest to have these two, particularly as the elections come closer. However, what I don't see that's on the table is, let's make these negotiations the basis of how we break up Iraq's borders. I mean, I just think, and this is where it's going to be difficult, where the Kurds will say, well, our end state's got to be independence. That's just not on the table. I mean, if it's Erbil, Duhok, and Suleimania, I think that can happen tomorrow. But the idea of the disputed territories being negotiable at this time, I think that's unrealistic. Secondly, it's not just about Baghdad, because Iraq's a different place now after Daesh. It's about what different minority groups want. It's about the Turkmen. It's about Sunni Arab groups that are in these areas. It's about what the provincial councils are saying. So there's a lot more people now to get on board than just Baghdad and Erbil. Okay, in my view, the prime minister has to has to assuage all of these different Iraqi groups that are not negotiating about disputed territories. That's one part. The other part, internally, I agree, but it depends on, there's a lot of moving parts right now. If you can see these disparate Kurdish groups came together when they felt like there was a large amount of people against them, whether that was reactions in the parliament, internationally. So if that continues, that's a good means of bringing people together and deflecting, again, the problems internally. It also depends how long the Daesh campaign goes on. A lot of these external issues are a good way for local actors, Kurdish officials, to displace their internal problems. At some point, and I've seen different trends inside the region, about very angry local populations that find no way to legitimately express their opposition, so they're doing things underground, radicalization and things like that. That would be my concern. So is there going to be a real challenge to the KDP and Barzani? Nope, I don't think so, not for the near term. However, there could be more political bottlenecks, and I don't see some of these political issues getting resolved as long as this larger issue is still on the table.
Thank you very much. And to Kadir and Leslie, since the beginning, in the last couple of weeks, we see increasing interactions between Turkey and other neighbors of the KRG region, including Iran and Iraq itself. So what do you think the impact of this referendum and this process for the future will be to the relations between Turkey and Iran and Turkey and Iraq?
I think that Turkey was obviously very dissatisfied with the KRG's decision to go ahead and hold the referendum. Turkey likes to believe that it has a lot of leverage in the region. Barzani has been a good partner to Turkey. And, I think that they were obviously dissatisfied. I think they called it treachery that the referendum went ahead and moved ahead. And there's been a lot of rhetoric, again, about like shutting down pipelines. And, but I think at the end of the day, I think we will continue to hear this rhetoric from Turkey, but I think their hope is that they can sort of dissuade the KRG from moving ahead with actual steps towards independence. Because at the end of the day, Turkey benefits economically from its partnership with the KRG. The last thing it really wants is to shut down the pipelines. I think it's prepared to possibly do it. This isn't to say that, you won't see sort of harsh actions taken by Turkey, but I think at the end of the day, that's not what Turkey wants. So that would be sort of my assessment of sort of how Turkey, they're sort of in a wait and see pattern with how the KRG makes their next moves.
Kadir, do you want to?
Yeah, I think Dan explained it really well, all these things that need to be done. I think, first of all, there is a real danger here of conflict. I mean, tomorrow, next week, we can see actual conflict on the ground between, especially in the disputed territories. Hashdi Shaabi seems to be on the move. We don't know how hard Iran is going to come down, and we don't know how soon and how hard Barzani is going to push for negotiations and especially some sort of declaration. So, worst case scenario, all hell breaks loose, and we have conflict in the western part of Kurdistan region. And then the other extreme scenario is nothing will happen. This is going to be just a symbolic move that nobody will be able to act upon. Baghdad will refuse to negotiate it under any circumstances. And in that situation, perhaps the border can remain open. Turkey may not, try to choke the region, etc. One of the triggers will be what happens to Turkmens in Kirkuk. So if there's real danger to Turkmens and Turkey for domestic, also political reasons, they need to act. They'll go into a punitive measure, like they'll have to apply punitive measures. But reality is usually between two extremes. So you may see some lull until the elections in April, I believe, for Baghdad. And if maybe Kurds will say, let's see what the next administration's mood is going to be about negotiations. They'll just talk about negotiating and use the referendum result as a sort of leverage, but they may not make any actual sudden moves and be patient. So that seems to be a more likely scenario. But again, it may not be enough for Iran. You don't know what they will want to do exactly. So if you have more conflict, you're going to get securitization, you're going to have shutdown of the border. Turkey has already amassed its troops there. But if there's a middle scenario, I think Turkey will look at the situation and see where they can agree with regional actors, like especially Iran and Baghdad government, and where there are agreements and disagreements. But I don't think they're ready, as Dan was talking about, especially without a meaningful prior conversation about what happens to all the oil. One of the central pieces is oil exports, and that goes through Turkey. So it's a serious problem, and I think going forward it's a bit foggy, but we shouldn't sort of count the extreme scenarios out of the picture. So,
thank you. And now we can open the floor for questions. there's any, please identify yourself, and if you can keep it, because we have a pretty, like 5-6 questions. I want to collect the first 3 of them, if you can start. Can we pass the mic? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having
Please hold it close to your mouth.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm Victoria McCollum with McCollum Company. We're implementing a project in the IDP camps in Hanke, Barhaka, and Harsham, and Dubuk and Erbil. And I'm curious if there's been any discussion at this point how the referendum and the results may affect the KRG's support and assistance to the IDPs that are living in the region now.
We can have the mic, if you can just pass it, Jen.
Hi, my name is Yerevan Said, and I'm a PhD
I can't hear you.
Hi.
It's on?
It's on. Can you?
Okay. My name is Yerevan Said, and I'm a PhD student at George Mason School of Conflict and Resolution. And before my question, I'd just like to make 2 statements. First of all, I really
If you can keep it very brief, we have.
Yeah,
also
sure,
questions.
sure. I really
Yeah.
take issue with any view that make this economic and political, reasons as a premises of their analysis, because the Kurdish struggle has never been about economic or political reason. It has been about recognition, and the referendum has been an extension, and also the driving force behind the referendum has been recognition, nothing else. That's really important to keep in mind in any kind of analysis, in my view. And also, secondly, which is my question, is to what extent Baghdad's overreaction, as well as the reactions by the neighboring country, which has been really extreme, could expedite KRG's path towards independence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we can have a question over here.
Thank you. Is it on? Thank you very much. I'm Hatem Al-Anbar from Iraq Embassy. First, I would like to say that it's unfair to describe Iraq as a failed state or even close, at least according to UN definition. My question to Leslie, how far do you think Turkey can go regarding how it reacts to KRG referendum? And do you think it can reach to cutting the oil export, or at least coordinating with Baghdad to, in a way that Baghdad that sells the oil, not the KRG? And my question to Denise, welcome back, and I
Thank
hope
you.
you had a good time.
Great trip.
Thank you.
I actually crossed the Tigris and I went to the Kishla.
Great.
Yeah.
Natalia, my question, what do you think could potentially change U.S. position? Iraq, hopefully it will not change, of course, but what could potentially change U.S. administration position regarding what KRG is doing? Thank you.
Thank you. We will collect another set of questions after this. We have 4 questions, 2 comments. This time, let's start with you, Dennis.
Okay. One of the questions is about the IDPs. I don't see any of that changing. I mean, if you were in Dubuk and Erbil, that's under the KDP administration, right? And I don't see that authority weakening. So that's just a matter of where revenues are channeled. So it would be a revenue issue in the sense of, will any of this change the revenues that go to political party, to a government that will then enable these things? And I don't necessarily see that occurring unless there's a great break. I mean, Baghdad is not necessarily providing that monies to those IDPs, well, in some part, but a lot of this is coming internationally, correct?
Yeah, I guess a follow-up question would be like the logistics of that. So if Turkey does close the border and limits trucks across the border as being discussed, how
Well,
will that affect the
well, I
care
remember in the
requirements?
days in the 90s when the borders were closed, we'd have to go through Syria and take that boat over, or there's a lot of there's other outlets that you can go through, take a plane inside Iraq and then take a plane there. So there's not going to be completely cut off. That's one option. But Erivan, I don't think, I don't want to speak for Dan about underestimating that this is not an economic or political issue. And that obviously, but there's also the sentiments of people and the manipulations of political leaders. And I think that I'm not going to underestimate at all the emotive value of all of this. But people are making calculations too, politically and economically. I don't think for a minute that people are saying we're just fighting for Kirkuk because it's a historical issue. There's a lot of money and a lot of resources in there, and that's just politicians, not people. So
Can we,
let me just
let's
answer.
finish this.
So you're saying to what?
Excuse me, let's finish the answer.
Washington,
Excuse
Let me
me.
answer.
Texas, Sicily.
Let me answer. Those comparisons are really not even appropriate. To what extent are others overreacting? This is even the question. No, I'll speak to you as friends. We've known each other for a while. Even the question. If you continue to look at this as everybody else is overreacting, particularly after Dan's eloquent discussion about the importance of recognition, okay? This is not about us, everybody against us. If you don't have the recognition of everybody else, taking emotions aside, it doesn't matter whether you think they're overreactions or not. They are what they are. It's the political reality you have to deal with as a landlocked state. So it's not whether is it fair or not. It is what it is. They're not overreactions because this is what everybody else perceives it as being. Had it been done in a different way, that's the question I would ask. How do we limit the types of reactions that occurred? That's the only pragmatic way I can see going forward. Not that similarly, are you wrong for doing this? No, it's just the way that you did it. Okay, so that's the way I would answer that one. There's other question about Iran. Did somebody ask a question about?
Not yet.
Huh?
Okay, maybe.
No. Somebody.
I'm expecting that. If not, I will ask.
Okay, no, but was there another question? Somebody asked another question? Oh, yes.
No, not yet.
No. You asked a question about
how could the U.S.
what could change.
evolve?
You mean evolve in support of the KRG or evolve in support?
Either.
I don't see, again, I don't speak for any U.S. government
sure, but
agency.
what-
I just don't see under this administration. Remember what this administration is about, okay? It's not about going in and engaging in demographic or territorial engineering or breaking up states. It's about enhancing U.S. interests. We're not going to get more involved with troops on the ground, but working with strategic partners in the region. With that said, to what extent would Iranian influence in certain parts of the region increase? To what extent, what would the next government of Iraq look like? Will it be in U.S. interests? Will any of these, how will the KRG move? Will the KRG be a spoiler in some of this, and that could move us in another direction, right? So a lot of this has to be framed in the mindset of this administration and what its priorities are. What are our national security interests? And we're not going to go in and, the commitment to the territorial integrity of states and countering violent extremism. That's the way I would frame this. And anything else should be framed within what our strategic priorities are, not can we champion the cause of a certain group. It's just not working that way. That's what I see.
Daniel, do you want to add?
Denise and I discussed this a little bit earlier. I think there is, in the Pentagon in particular, among the uniformed military, an enormous sympathy with the Kurds of Iraq and the Kurds of Syria now as well. These are people we fought with, we've helped to protect. And I think what I don't know is how that plays in the policy formulation process inside Washington. And Denise may well be right that the thing we will keep our focus on is our national interests and a very rigorous calculation of those, and those are in favor of keeping sovereign states intact. But I wouldn't hide the fact that there are strong sympathies with the Kurds in influential places in Washington.
Thank you. And there was a specific question on Turkey, since you are, Kadir and Leslie is the co-author of the report, so I will turn them if... And if you want to respond any other questions, you can go.
Yeah, and like I said, Kadir can probably speak to this as well. As far as Turkey's, reaction in shutting down the pipeline, there's been some rhetoric about it. I think that at the end of the day, I don't think Turkey wants very badly to do it. It's, economically important for them too. I think a lot of it is, really Turkey continuing to try to dissuade Erbil and to sort of try to shape what happens next. Turkey's been very adamant about its support for Iraqi territorial integrity. They've also, come out with statements saying that, they will be working with Baghdad on oil sales. So again, I think we're sort of in a wait and see at this point. It's going to, from my assessment, depend a little bit on what Erbil's next moves are, and sort of how this continues to play out internally within Iraq, just in terms of what happens with the future of the pipeline. So like you said, Qadir might have other or different.
Excuse me, this recognition question actually is relevant here. I think there was recognition, right? The reason for the referendum, the audience members said that it was about recognition, but there existed recognition. It just wasn't recognition of an independent state. That's a whole other game. Barzani had a lot of legitimacy inside Turkey. It had international legitimacy. Europeans and others, you have a structure that's there and everybody recognizes it. But going from there to an independent state without sort of the international backing, that seems to be the sort of crux of the issue. And everything else is related to this, right? So we will, if Turkey is considering punitive measures, but how serious is KRG about this? How soon they want to go forward? Because this is a relationship that Turkey has developed over the years, and it has security aspects, energy concerns, economic investments there. Turkey doesn't want to just, give it up, but Iraq's territorial unity is important for Turkey, not just for the idea of the, territorial integrity. It's important for every state, and it has implications for every interest that Turkey has on the ground, including PKK and oil exports, etc. And then to your question, whether the border gets closed, there was actually this news in Turkish media that they were considering this other smaller border to open up and close the larger one. If Syrian border policy is any kind of an indication of how it might play, is that you would want to reduce the economic activity to weaken Barzani's basically, sort of argument for independence, that we are able to export, we have business, etc. But I don't think they're going to do something that would cause humanitarian crisis inside the border, because remember Kobani crisis, they were very against PYD's fight there, not fight against ISIS, but to as a political game that they were playing, but they did receive all the refugees. So I think Turkey will be careful about. These days I'm writing something on humanitarian activities of Turkey, so that's going to be a concern. I don't think they'll want a situation where thousands are along the border suffering, etc. So this is going to be related to that question as well.
Can I just want to make one statement too about the pipeline and leverage and what can happen. Remember another thing, that most of the oil that the KRG is sending out through the Iraqi-Turkish pipeline, most of it's in Kirkuk. Okay, there is no real reserves of significance inside the Kurdistan region. You've had a multitude of oil companies fleeing, and what I've been told recently is they're just not coming back, at least under current oil prices. So the question to me is, if more than 50% or 50% of your 60 is contingent on this pipeline, and that pipeline, I don't know, gets blown up, gets ruined, and with the liberation of Hawija, that second pipeline at some point can be rebuilt by the Iraqi government, so that the Iraqi government has control of that pipeline directly with Turkey. What I'm saying is, it's not there's so much leverage in the KRG's hands because it's got control of the only pipeline. I would look at this as extremely vulnerable, particularly if negotiations occur between Turkey and the Iraqi government and Arab communities where the pipeline, Arab villages where the pipeline is, well, they can just circumvent the pipeline that the Kurds have and deal with each other directly. I mean, there's a lot of, in my view, several options that can be done at a strategic level that can further undermine the KRG. And the worry would be, if I was the KRG, what happens if you no longer have control of Kirkuk, because there is no significant revenue coming out of the KRG.
Thank you.
Yes. Hello? Yes, can you hear me? So, Maurizio Geri from Old Dominion University. I come originally from Italy, and we have problems in Italy too, not only UK and Spain. Also, Venice wants to have some kind of referendum. But because of this situation...
Forza Venezia.
Venezia, exactly. So, who do you think, Professor Serwar, who could be the third-party negotiator in the future? Because we understood that US probably is not interested, and in the past didn't succeed much anyway between Israel and Palestine, and European Union is not much interested in secessionist movements. There has been cases in which international NGOs, like INACE, have been having a very important role. Who can be recognized as a legitimate negotiator in the future? And if not, nobody could, because between Erbil and Baghdad, between Abadi, as you said, and the other, there is a lot of difficulties to really decide on many difficult issues. Do you think that in the future the Kurdistan of Iraq could be put inside an international conference after the ISIS, territorial ISIS has been annihilated, an international conference that take care about both Iraq and Syria, and so put inside a regional solution for the Levant? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? We can collect those as well. There are two questions.
Hi. Yasser El-Shimi, George Washington University. So historically, in most cases where independence has been declared through a secessionist group, war is often what comes next. And I heard on the panel that the war scenario is considered to be an extreme scenario, but I don't necessarily think it's actually that far-fetched, given the recent escalation that has been taking place. And I guess my question to the panelists is, how do they see a violent conflict actually playing out between the Iraqi army and the Kurdish forces, and what are the chances of regional spillover as well?
Thank you. And the last question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Vince LaFosse, Eurasia Review. There is one country that really wasn't discussed. It's not Ron College, but I'm wondering about Israel's role in this. Because just like Kurdistan, the Jews were fighting for independence in 1948. There's also a recognition of a Kurdistan homeland. And you know, I've seen pictures of people in Erbil waving Kurdish flags, but I've also seen them waving Israeli flags, which you don't really see in a very hostile region. Just like Israel, Kurdistan surrounded by hostile central governments, Israel was surrounded by hostile partners right after independence. And as Israel is a democracy, what kind of role model can Israel play into a possible independent Kurdistan? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a set of questions. The possible third-party negotiator, the scenarios for violent conflict, Israel's role in this, and Dennis, for you, I add Iran's role as well, if you can tell us a little more. Can we start with you?
So far as the mediator is concerned, the Americans offered to mediate before the referendum. They wanted the negotiation to start before the referendum, and I think there were kind of pre-negotiations going on. I anticipate that the Americans will still be willing afterwards. We have very strong relationships with both parties. We've armed Baghdad and Erbil. They have been allied with us in fighting ISIS. I think the Americans are kind of the obvious choice. If it's not the Americans, could there be some kind of international conference? I sure as hell hope not. I think the notion of an international conference to redraw the borders of the Middle East is a truly dreadful idea, and one whose time I hope never comes. For war scenarios, Denise, you'll want to answer this as well, but in my way of thinking, there's only one war objective on both sides, and it's called Kirkuk. Arab Iraq isn't going to want to invade up to, Zako. I mean, that's not, what would they want with that? If they can take Kirkuk and hold it, they've got the Kurdish lifeline, and that would pretty much end the war. By the same token, if the Kurds can take and hold Kirkuk, they have Kirkuk, if they can hold Kirkuk, independence is at least possible, not inevitable, but possible. So I think the center of gravity, for now at least, is Kirkuk. Spillover almost guaranteed, I would say. And on the question of Israel, I mean, quite clearly the Israelis have grown very close with Iraqi Kurdistan over the years. They've helped militarily and intelligence terms. They're buying Iraqi Kurdistan's oil when nobody else will. They've come out in favor of partition of Iraq. They themselves are a result of a partition. There are all sorts of reasons why the Israelis would support independent Iraqi Kurdistan, but that just makes it less likely to happen given the regional situation.
Dennis?
I'll start with the conflict. I fully agree with you. That's why when everyone always is talking about how do we prepare for independence, I think there's that's just so, that's still a pipe dream. But the reality of conflict, and in addition, is very strong. And I agree with Dan fully on Kirkuk, and it's different now after Daesh. It's not just Kirkuk. Kirkuk as an economic lifeline, yes, but in the time that I was there, you've got other areas that were disputed before Daesh. Mendele, there was conflicts. This is not just between Baghdad and Erbil. I'd like to get away from it's about an Iraqi army thing. There's a lot, and let's get away from Shia militias thing. There's a lot of militias of lots of different groups. Christian, Assyrian, Yazidi, PKK. And so there's a lot of reasons why a lot of groups who are all struggling for territories right now want their peace. That's where the conflict is. Sinjar, right? It's Kirkuk, but it's also Sinjar. Who's going to get that? Who's going to get parts of the Nineveh Plain? Mendele, Diyala, and I can go on. So these are all the second line or hot spots in addition to the Kirkuk areas that there's multiple actors, sub-state actors. So people are preoccupied with fighting Daesh, but there's a lot of people now who are very angry at this unilateral move made by the Kurds too. So that's where I would be focusing on. I quite frankly think that Israel, if they wanted to help the Kurds, they just did the opposite. I mean, unless they're a direct regional actor who is going to come to military protection of the Kurds, championing the Kurds' cause in a region that is surrounded by Iranians and Arabs, and this was not helpful. And so I don't see how that would in any way positively advance any support of regional actors other than look at this as some kind of nefarious move to break up Iraq and act as a buffer for Iran, which is what most people think it is anyway. So I mean, I'll be blunt. And so that, many Kurdish people I know would say that too, like, okay, support us, but just be quiet about it. You're not helping us. And so, I would say that. You asked about Iran's role. Well, again, let's be clear. This has always been, one of the dominant narratives is Iran has so much influence in Baghdad. Iran has got just as much, if not more, influence inside the Kurdistan region. So I know, a couple hundred kilometers plus of border bordering the Kurdish region. I don't see how we can talk about Iraq and say Iran is not going to have influence. It's a state, it borders the Iraq, it will. The point is, to what extent do some of these, let's just say, undisciplined militias, backed by the IRGC, will maintain influence? And I'll tell you one thing that's a trend that I saw in the region, that some Sunni Arab groups are joining the IRGC-backed groups, okay? Not just the amenable Hashd al-Sha'b that most people respect and admire for fighting Daesh. The AAH and the Hizb ut-Tahrir in places of disputed areas are courting, supporting, and funding, and so some of these Sunni Arab groups are joining them as their choice. So this is something, a trend that you should watch and say, where's Iran's role? Well, this is also some of their options, because it's as a way of security and who's going to provide security to the areas. And it's not a Shia thing, okay? It's a Sunni Arab joining these areas to be used to, let's get something else.
Lastly, Kadir and Leslie, if you want to end or comment about any questions.
Yeah, just, in terms of the violent conflict, like, again, I think it's not something that Turkey wants, but I think that Turkey has rhetorically and through actions recently proven that it's something that it is very much open to through its military exercises on the border. Also, they've struck PKK positions in Sinjar. I think that they're very concerned about the possibility of the PKK consolidating, or any Iranian sort of influence consolidating in Sinjar. And I think that if you see sort of a security vacuum in conflict going on, that they will be quick to be very, very concerned about that region in particular. They've also been very vocal for a long time about their desire not to see Kirkuk fall into, be under solidified control by the KRG, especially because of the Turkoman minorities that are involved there. They're concerned about the security for them. So again, I'm not trying to downplay that Turkey's ready or that we won't see it. I just think that it's, hopefully not inevitable.
Well, most of it has been said already, but the only reason I described it as an extreme scenario is we don't know if KRG is going to declare it, right? So they've done the referendum, but if they declare it, then it becomes if they do it right now or within the next few months, that will be I agree with you. In that case, like it was described, Kirkuk, Sinjar, many hot points, and I was going to say it could bring in outside regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and it's going to just be very complicated. And we saw PKK actually endorsing this referendum, although they have real serious, they really, until a couple months ago, Barzani was asking them to leave Sinjar. So it's a complicated relationship, but PKK ended up endorsing it just so that, I guess, to annoy Turkey. But how PKK is going to try to enlarge its area of influence will also have an influence on how Turkey protects its border and goes in, and what kind of operations it joins, as I mentioned before, Turkmens as well. With the Israel thing, I think it's a long-standing relationship they have. It's the classic periphery non-Arab allies policy, and they buy oil from there. But I think what we didn't see is serious Israeli lobbying internationally, right? They didn't get up and say everybody, and they didn't seriously lobby the U.S. to do. I'm suspecting that they don't see it as an immediate, real possibility. I may be downplaying it a bit too much, but I think for them, it being anti-Iran and having an ally right next to Iran is a very important driver in that sense. So I agree with Denise, it didn't help that there were Israeli flags there to the Kurdish cause, I guess.
I think we should note that KRG officials have been telling everybody who will listen that there'll be no declaration of independence for 2 years after the referendum. So whether they'll stick with that, I don't know, but that's what they've been telling everybody.
Thank you very much. And thanks for joining us. And please join me to thank for our panelists. Thank you.